All right, thank you for joining the Finance Committee meeting on August 31st. We have Mrs. McKittrick, Miss Autry, and Dr. Hall, and Mr. Bravo from the board in attendance. I think I got everybody. I did. And then Superintendent James joining us. We have a lot to update on tonight on all three areas of our broad topics. So the first is legislative. And are we okay to get jumping right into it, Diana and Derek?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. All right, it's been a few days last week, both in person and virtually, and then again today, meeting as a request of Speaker Cupp, Representative John Patterson, and Representative Gary Shearer, who are leading the Fair School Funding Plan update to House Bill 305. And so we kind of completed this both in person and virtual whirlwind tour. And actually, the last meeting is tonight virtually for any member of the General Assembly who wasn't able to attend, with the intention of launching substitute House Bill 305, getting it out and passed in the House, and getting it introduced through a substitute bill in the Senate within the next few weeks. There seems to be a lot of momentum for this. That's very, very exciting. As you know, Representative Cupp is now the Speaker of the House with the changes that we've seen in Columbus. Representative Patterson is widely respected on both aisles, and Representative Gary Shearer, Republican, has stepped in to assist Rep. Patterson in this initiative. There are over 70 of the 99 House members already signed on to this, and it is getting widespread support. I included on the public-facing part of the agenda the Fair School Funding Plan updated summary, and that walks through the differences between the original House Bill 305 and the amended House Bill 305, which should be dropped or introduced back to the legislature. My guess is by September 14th. I've made mention of that.
Hey, Ryan.
Yes.
Hey, Ryan. Hey, just a quick question for you. You mentioned that this has broad support. You mentioned about 70 folks have signed on. And I know that in the State House, it's about, what, 60, 65 Republican, what, 30 or so Democrat? Yeah, I'm just curious. Do you know, just a ballpark, how many Democrats are signed on to this?
I think at last count, we had every Democrat.
Oh, okay. So the issue is getting, okay. All right. So, okay. That makes, okay. Now I understand. Okay.
Yeah. So
sorry, go ahead.
When it was first introduced, Dr. Hall, we had 66 co-sponsors. And so that was last year. And that was last June, which is pretty amazing. And that support has even grown from here. And we were around the state of Ohio answering the questions of how the formula is improved, some of the critiques. I'll give you a chance to read that summary plan, and we can bring it back to next Finance Committee. Invite you to testify, invite you to witness testimony, both virtually or in person. The big push and hurdle is going to be the Senate. We do have two senators that I know, Representatives Shearer and Patterson, have been working with, potentially identified to issue a substitute bill. And as soon as that's public, it will be very exciting to share with you about who that could be and about how that could companion with the House bill component of this. So let's set the stage for substitute House Bill 305 and kind of why now. So why now? We have not had a real formula in Ohio for years, but it's rearing its ugly head now more than ever. We had two back-to-back state budget reductions that you're aware of, in aggregate last year and this year about 3.7% budget cuts to school funding. That was applied in quintile. So basically the wealthiest districts to the poorest districts in 5 different equal groupings, and it was applied based on wealth. We also know at the same time that there's been 3 rounds of federal stimulus plans dollars. We've reviewed those here with the board in depth, and the superintendent knows that those 3 rounds of stimulus funds have been applied in 3 different methodologies. And then as we're telling this story, and then you start to see senator and representative eyes kind of widen here, and they say, and then you tell them about success and wellness funds that David and I received, and the district received, in lieu of state foundation formula increases last year with a new governor. And those are restricted, and that has a different methodology. And then to top it all off, when you kind of overwhelm them in this conversation, you say, oh, and let's just pretend. I'm not simplifying. I hope you don't. This is just a story that has been told around the state. Let's just pretend that there's a global pandemic. And let's just pretend that there's been millions, hundreds of millions, if not trillions of dollars invested in technology, both in education and in businesses, to prop up organizations so that they can compete, so that kids can attend. And that money has been applied differently. And so it's so overwhelmingly time now to have a comprehensive fair school funding plan that the refreshing part about this is when we had money and both sides of the aisles are competing for interest in this money, we can't seem to finish the conversation about what's right for kids. So we take away money, we say the state doesn't have money, and all of a sudden we can finish the conversation. So that's been rather exciting. I'm really pumped up about this because it seems like now, as we're heading into lame duck, as we're heading into a new General Assembly, we may have a new Speaker of the House. We most likely will have a new President of the Senate. And leadership is going to change the priorities. And I think they're quickly realizing that with ed choice, with the state budget the way it is, and shortcomings there, and without a school funding formula heading into the next biennium, they've got to start getting some of this done. So we have a small window to get that accomplished in September through the end of the year. And I'm really excited to be a part of that on behalf of you and the district and the state of Ohio. But I may even ask you to help with that. Ms. Autry, we've talked about, we know some of your passions are around community engagement. This can't proceed unless we start communicating with our public, both here in Akron and across the state of Ohio, that we have to do what's right for all kids in Ohio. It can't be 612 individual school districts. And why is it good? It will help with levy fatigue. It will help with the fact that Akron Public Schools in the 17 school districts in Summit County, we pay some of the highest median income taxes, as superintendent and I have focused, and why you've made really hard decisions to reduce your footprint and reduce the tax burden on your community. So it's going to help over time restore this proper school funding formula. So that's my summary on House Bill 305. There's going to be I know there's session tomorrow. The Speaker of the House has called session tomorrow, and then within the next few weeks we may have testimony. Now, any questions on the Fair School Funding Plan? And it is attached to your agenda.
So what is it that families could do now?
I don't know that we can do anything quite yet. What we need to do is make sure that this is a possibility in the legislature. It needs to be introduced in the House again. So it'll come in as substitute House Bill 305. I anticipate that middle of September. When that happens, we as an organization need to start immediately communicating with our public through Mark Williamson's department, through Facebook, through PTAs, through finance committees, and reporting on that at every one of our committee meetings. And we have a plethora of information to share. We have summary one-pagers, so we shouldn't have to reinvent any of that documentation. But it probably, I guess the first thing is, let's get the General Assembly to call session back. Let's make sure it's going to get introduced. And the second that it happens, we can start that campaign. I think we were laying the groundwork for that to happen through our representatives within this past week. But it's going to be fast and furious and very quick when it does happen.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks. The simulations for House Bill 305 should be out around September 11th. I'll share with you those simulations and start prepping anyone. I know that Dr. Akbar has expressed an interest, both from his studies side and his professional day job. And when I've talked to him a little bit about the Fair School Funding Plan in terms of equity and how equity is really baked in through every component of this formula, from the base cost to the distribution to categoricals. And the last kind of plug I'll make here is I made a plea individually on behalf of Akron and the Fair School Funding Plan to every senator and every representative that we met with, is this has to be adopted in its entirety. And if it's not, we'll be back to a set of patchwork formula that isn't good for anybody. So in southeastern Ohio, where Switzerland of Ohio has 500 square miles to transport kids, the transportation part of the formula doesn't work, and they have to take money out of the classroom to educate kids. Or economically disadvantaged in Akron isn't sufficiently funded, so we have to take money out of the classroom where we're educating kids. Or food service in another district, or special needs in another district. So this is a comprehensive recommendation that has to be adopted by law. Okay. Not that that's probably in a few generation, one of the more serious, time-sensitive topics. We have another legislative initiative about ed choice and why we have to act now. So ed choice on its own was one of the more difficult things that the General Assembly dealt with in this past few years. And we've talked about joining lawsuits. I've got a little bit of an update there and where this ed choice is. But the General Assembly knows that if they don't start taking components off of this, they're going to have a very difficult time electing new leadership, getting new leadership, and working with the governor's office on a new biennium budget for July 1. So when these things start picking up, they're going to start working through the legislature very fast. So ed choice, it stands right now is there's been a lot of individual meetings with legislators around ed choice. I sent out an article, hopefully you received the article from the Cincinnati Enquirer, and it was reprinted last Sunday by the Beacon Journal. If you don't have that, I will make sure to get that posted to your notes. And for the first time, it really shows dollars and cents along with academic performance. And so there's a big spotlight being shined on the amount of money that's being transferred from local districts versus the state share. Just to remind everybody that the state share of school district before you apply any of the categoricals or any of the distribution is $6,020. We don't really know what that buys you right now because there isn't a formula. But when you apply the state share minus the categoricals, Akron Public Schools gets a little less than $4,800 a kid. But when a child takes a voucher, both performance and or income, they're taking that $6,000. Plus, as we know, and as is required by law, we're responsible for transporting those kids. Right? I believe that Akron Public Schools is the right infrastructure. We've got a long storied business of providing good and safe transportation. And I'm not even arguing that we shouldn't provide transportation, but we should be compensated fairly for that. There are recent studies done that says for a community and charter school, it's about 1.5 times what it costs a public education student and what to transport. In a non-public, it can cost 2 to 3 times that of our public school counterpart. And so part of that fair school funding plan is recognizing that in the formula, so we're not saying we shouldn't transport, we're just saying fairly compensate the districts, and then you're transferring the 6,000 instead of the state share that we get. And then you've also seen in the Ed Choice conversation that we're responsible of providing another $1.2 million to non-publics from our CARES Act funds. And this is where all those formulas really don't mesh well is, and just to kind of prove the point here, the $1.2 million is a per pupil allocation for every non-public school kid. It is not based on economically disadvantaged, which is how we received our money. So further, the federal government's passing along additional money per pupil to non-public students than they are Akron Public School students. What we're just asking for is a fair and reasonable formula to do that. So Ed Choice is going to be a very heated, debated topic, and you're going to see a lot of conversation around that. I do know, as an update to the lawsuit, there are over 30 districts signed on to the lawsuit. The first large district just signed on, and I don't know that that is public, but I will be talking to that district this week. And so the district has, I would say, large district, more than 10,000 students. And so as I expressed to the executive director of Equity and Adequacy, Bill Phyllis, late last week when talking to him about this subject, I said, one of the concerns we have about joining a lawsuit is that when this proceeds, and this may take multiple years, if we're proportionate in sharing our costs, which is what the fee structure is, $2 per kid. So our initial investment's $40,000. If this goes further into court, are we going to continue on that? And is Akron going to be paying such a large share on behalf of a district that has 1,500 kids or 2,000 kids? Is something that I need to evaluate a little bit more now that a few of the larger districts have come online. All right, so lots going on in the legislative world, but things are going to start heating up here as we approach lame duck, which is right after election time, and maybe even a session before election. Any questions on that?
I actually do. So part of me, again, I'm learning, and I know this whole transportation piece, I guess I'm trying to understand, is it because the size of our district, why that responsibility falls with us? And what's the likelihood of that ever changing, where districts have to provide their own transportation? Why does that fall in our lap?
Here's my opinion, actually, some based on legal and law, with how community and charter schools were started and funded some 20 plus years ago, is the greatest and most dependable infrastructure is your public school system, right? We've been around for 150 years, and so we're well versed. We don't default on our debt. We're very great stewards. I mean, like academically so, great stewards of financial taxpayer dollars. I think I've repeated, no public school district has ever defaulted on their debt. And we've got all the infrastructure with school buses and special education identification and delivery and food service. And we've become experts in those areas. So some 20 years ago, when school choice became an initiative from our state legislature, it was realized that that was such a large startup cost, we wanted the district of residence to be the one who is ultimately responsible. You asked me if I do not think that will change. And I've been told that it's a federal requirement that we're responsible for transporting those students. It's also a federal requirement that any resident student here, we're responsible for the identification and special education services, and to attend, and correct me if I'm wrong, Superintendent James, to attend every IEP meeting, whether it be in the district or out of the district, serving an open enrollment or non-public or choice student. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. And Ms. Autry, as I'm advocating for a new funding formula and giving these examples, I'm on one hand saying to the General Assembly, I believe we are the right organization to provide those services. There isn't anybody better. But you can't have Akron taxpayers subsidize those services for other organizations. We need to be fully compensated, whether it be directly from the state or from those educating districts where our students are transferring from. Any other questions on the legislative front? All right, so 30,000-foot perspective. Now let's start in under district-wide financial information. If you are looking at the agenda, I posted 2 documents there. The first is pre-audit meeting. That is a private meeting between the board and the state auditor's office. But the entrance document, feel free to open that, and I can share screen if anybody wants me to share screen, just give me a high sign. Otherwise, I'll walk you through just briefly what this is looking like. The reason that I'm putting this on the Finance Committee is I would really like for the board to continue to play a very active role in the audit. As I came on about 6 years ago, and I know Mr. Bravo was on the board then and on Finance Committee, I would say that the board was meeting as it relates to the audit about once a year. And I'd like to elevate that a little bit more. We might not, the pre-audit meeting is not a mandatory meeting, but in the size and scope and the transparency of an organization, I think this is a really important first step. And so as you just look through the entrance conference agenda, it's 20 pages long. And you'll see, the first and foremost, you'll see the regional contacts, senior audit managers, local audit managers. This will be a great time for any board member or the Finance Committee to ask questions as it relates to the audit. They talk about the audit scope and agenda. They talk about what findings are, what management letter comments are, what agenda verbal. And so if you're new to this, it's really hard to follow along the financial talk that we have and realize, you know, where should I be extracting the goals and stretches and pluses and minuses of the district? Because right, with a $500 million organization, there's always improvements that we can make. They go through the emerging and significant issues. Obviously, they've been highlighting COVID. And so a good question for you, both throughout the audit and at the end of the audit, is how did we do in coding our COVID expenditures, right? And I think we've already got a great jump start on that with our return reopening committee. And then they go through the financials. Obviously, we do that every year and do gap conversion kind of things. And then at the very end, you'll see the very last, let's see, page 19. You can see whose responsibility it is and what component of the audits. And again, if you remember from the single audit, when we did the summary, that's that last schedule of findings pages. And it says, you know, any material weaknesses, any significant deficiencies of the federal funds received, was there any question costs? And they really go through a lot of that in detail. And then they finally rate you a high, medium, or low risk auditee. Any questions on the pre-audit meeting? And a reminder, that is tomorrow at noon. And again, that is for anybody tuning in tonight, that is a private meeting between the state auditor's office and the board. All right. Next item is the review of employee classifications. And we had talked about, as the state budget reductions were originally, you know, thought 10 to 15%, the reality of sales and income tax data in the state of Ohio beating estimates, and hoping, praying, and holding our breath that there's not a second peak of COVID, which would shut us down from a state financial perspective. We've been evaluating kind of this financial scenario. And just to kind of reiterate where the superintendent and I have been over the past few weeks and few months has been, to the extent possible, going to keep our employees whole with, and that's not just an assumption that is born on behalf of the superintendent, myself, but I think is shared amongst board members. And it is definitely an intent of our federal stimulus dollars. As you look through the 2 rounds of federal stimulus dollars, there's an intent that you're keeping people whole. And since there are supplanting, or there's flexibility in the use of those dollars, we can use it for the offsetting of supplies. Now you're saying, well, you're talking about employees, Ryan, so if you use it for supplies, you're not using it on staff. Well, if we didn't have these federal stimulus dollars and be spending millions of dollars on PPE, that'd be coming out of our staffing costs. So we have had the goal and value with our return reopening team that we're going to lessen the burden on general fund, which is loosely interpreted as we're going to protect employees, staffing, and programming as much as possible. So I included, from your direction, I included the March 23rd employee pay resolution. If you want to open that up, just so you can kind of follow along. The direction, let me read down through this just so we remind ourselves. I'll start kind of in the middle of the resolution because I do want to make sure that we're all on the same page and we can report so to the rest of the board. The March 23rd, 2020 also requires governments to limit operations to only essential functions. Remember that essential employee conversation we had. These orders are unprecedented steps taken by the Ohio Department of Health and the governor to combat the spread of COVID-19. The school closure will expire on April 3rd through the Director of the Ohio Department of Health and may extend the school closure. Most employees in the Akron City School District will receive normal compensation during this closure. Employees with certain job classifications could face a reduction in pay due to the school closure. Whereas at a special meeting of March 19th, the board passed a resolution authorizing the superintendent and treasurer at their discretion to begin processing payroll and further develop a resolution that provides for the continuity of payment to the employees through April 10th. And then it charges us to do that. You remember, then leading up to April 10th, the board passed a resolution saying we further support and enhance that resolution by directing the superintendent and treasurer to provide compensation for those employees. Now, we were not alone. We checked with all of our Ohio 8 colleagues. We checked with colleagues around the state of Ohio. I know superintendent and I went to our various committee structures at our professional organizations. And I will tell you, heading into this time now, every one of the Ohio 8 districts I have talked to, which has been 5 of the largest, intend to do exactly what we are doing, what we've been recommending thus far. And that is for the majority of our regular full-time and hourly employees proceeding as is. And talk a lot about why that is. We talk about furlough language, we talk about those kind of things. And even out of the recent conversations on behalf of our 3 education associations, they've now dropped the furlough language because everyone has realized that this truly is a temporary issue. This truly is the intent of federal stimulus plans to support and plug the budget gaps, as the Beacon just reported about, in terms of supplies and materials, and saving those monies for starting January when we start to go back blended. Because the savings would not be that great under furlough, but the disruption would be so great to attract and retain certificated, non-certificated staff, that again, I'm just reiterating the assumption that superintendent and Mr. Superintendent, please jump in here, because if we do need to go the route of identifying specific classifications for reduction, which, as we've mentioned in previous finance committee meetings, to balance the budget, we'll have to start that fairly soon. But it is not our intent to do that. David?
Yeah, right now it looks like all of our classifications will have duties that they'll need to perform for us, particularly as we get prepared for the start of school next week, or actually this week, and then into next week, or next week into the following week with our kindergartners and first graders. So there are lots of things that have to be done, and those first couple of weeks are going to be pretty busy for all of our staff. So there's work for all of them to do. And I spoke about that this morning with our union presidents meeting, because there were some questions about that. We reiterate it right now. It looks like we're going to need everybody we can get our hands on.
I'll pause there. I'll make one final comment on that resolution and see if you have any questions in this area. But the one final comment I have is, I just mentioned in the same section the pre-audit conference meeting. The auditors, if you read that letter, they will be requiring that work be performed. So just to follow up on the superintendent's comments, this isn't having pay go to employees without them providing a service. No, we are required to do that. There may be times where we're having, if they're working a little bit out of their classification, or we may have somebody doing a delivery of supplies or following up on home visits that wouldn't otherwise, we may have to do a time and attendance log or something like that, especially if those expenses are being applied through CARES Act. Any questions there? All right. So we started 30,000 foot perspective. We came to the district level, and now we're actually going to dive in to unit level analysis. And we've made some progress here. I want to get your feedback on some of this. And we're going to try to highlight just a certain area. I shared, Ms. Autry and Dr. Hall, I shared with you as finance committee members the folder, because we tried to do this in person a little bit so we could take a deeper dive, and you know, obviously with our resolution not to meet in person, we're going to delay that a little bit. So I gave you access to that folder, and if you look into that folder, there's what, a good 15 or 20 different charts from achievement and graduation and proficiency results to enrollment, staffing, average salary, to specific per pupil expenses and those kind of things. So what I wanted to do is finish up today with kind of a board facilitated conversation in looking at special education in our high schools and kind of pulling it down to a building by building level, kind of get your feedback and some of my aha moments. So let me try to share some screens here. Okay. Now you should be seeing a really busy page called Fivecast. Does everybody see that? Okay.
Yeah.
All right, great. Thanks for the verbal, because I can't see you in return. And let's update this detail. Just kind of return back to where it was. All right, I need to refresh it. So we're going to go into Fivecast. Expenses layout. High schools spend. All right. So if you're looking at this, the top left-hand part of the screen says Fivecast. And this is our accounting system downloaded into a Tableau type tool. It takes all 24 strings of our accounting, it downloads, and if you remember from our early orientation days, we can kind of get lost in those OPUs. Now I know this is still aggregate data, but eventually this is going to help tell a story. So we wanted to really focus on kind of one function area of our budget. So can everyone see my cursor?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
great. So
Is
we're
there
using,
any way to be larger though, at all?
yes, let me try to do that. How's that?
That's better.
Okay, great. So if everyone can see my cursor, it says 001 General Fund. And if you look to the right of that, you see 2019, 2020, and 21. 21 being fiscal year, so that's the 2021 school year. We're estimated to spend about $360 million in general fund. Now you see the second column where my cursor is, it says OPU. Now, again, this is accounting heavy, apologize for that. We will get labels made that a little bit easier, but this is where we're gonna be extracting the information from. OPU are our high school buildings, or just our building designation. So 405 is Pupil, 425 is East, 435 is Ellet, 445 is Firestone, and on down. And so at an aggregate level, I just wanted you to see how we can start to disaggregate this data, and then we can put this in presentation format. So in general, 360, if everybody can see my cursor, 360 million spent in general fund. That's all funds, all spending. That's our 5-year forecast. 1,200, where it says function level, 1,200 is pulled out of this report just on special education. So it says at 405 Pupil, we are spending this year about 1.9 million on special education instruction. So this is all certificated and non-certificated expenditures related to, and it is supplies and materials. So that's all of our spend in special education. Okay. So you can see as we go down through here, I'm going to highlight, just let you take some of this in. 425 is East. So Pupil, we spent 1.9 million, or we are spending 1.9 million this year. 425 is East, we're spending 2.1 million. 435 is Ellet at 1.9 million. 445 is 1.6 million at Firestone. 455 Kenmore Garfield, 1.9 million. 485 is North, 2.5 million. Okay, so we're gonna, okay, so that's busy, it's hard to follow, right? So let's take that to a spreadsheet. And right away, let's start. Let's go to the graph. Can everybody see the graph first?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. And you'll see the bar chart, and then you'll see the orange line. The bar chart is the building's annual budget. About what do we spend from general fund, total funds, at Bookdole, East, Ellett, Firestone, Kenmore Garfield, North, Early College, and STEM. You can see how Bookdole, East, you see this Firestone, we spend the most out of general fund, and Kenmore Garfield the least. And you can see this average here. Now, district-wide averages, we've talked about between 17 and 20% of our population is special education. And that matches our statewide reports. We also know that we have special education units because of economies of scale. And the superintendent can speak better than I can about which schools those are embedded in. I can make some inferences based on these financial stories, though. So here's where I think it's kind of interesting to dig into some detail here. Well, you know, I know we're talking about special education, but next I want to do technology. Next, I want to do technology about looking down to the per pupil spend in technology. And ultimately, this is going to advise the district, inform the board and administration how best to make an equitable distribution of resources and advise our policymaking. So I think this is, this is next level budget planning. This is where I believe the state of Ohio is going and is not yet there. So let's walk through some of these. Any questions? So because I can't see you, I want to make sure that I get any questions. Or if you want me to keep going.
I'm okay for you to keep going.
Okay. All right. Just interrupt me, please. So do you see the column highlighted here?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. And so that corresponds to the bar chart. And then from that disaggregated data, we look at what is our total spend there. Now, how many students are at each location? And here's where it starts to become very interesting. So looking at the chart, we immediately say, we're spending more money at Firestone than we are in any other building. And this is ultimately what led and advised the board in some of our school closures. And so what's interesting here is you look at the next highlighted per pupil amount. This is what we're spending on a per pupil basis, total fund. This is total general fund. This isn't federal funds wrapped in or anything like this, total general fund. And you'll see that we're around 10 to 11. We have a high of 13,000 and a low of 9,600. So why is that? And let's just focus on these two as we begin to think about that. So total, this isn't special education yet. We're not there yet. This is just total general fund spend divided by the number of kids. What corresponds directly to the total budget spent and how many students are receiving services there. So general fund, so the statement I think is true to say a full building can offer a full complement of services at the best economies of scale. That it is like a fair and accurate statement. Now, as we further disaggregate data, now let's look at special education. How much are we spending special education per pupil to the total spend? So we're spending, in Bookdale, we're spending about $1,880 per pupil, or 18% of the general fund budget on special education. I'll let you go down through that chart. So let's highlight the same two in this equation. And this is where, Superintendent, I'm going to need some help on this. I've highlighted the two. My assumption is that we have, in Kenmore Garfield, we have special education units, and my assumption is that we don't have those same units as Firestone. Can you comment on that? Kind of walk us through that?
Yeah, and some of our buildings serve as hubs for special education services. And I think like North High School, Kenmore Garfield, so they won't have the same types of units across the board.
Okay.
Hey Ryan, this is Derek.
Yes.
So I guess building off David's point, there probably are in healthcare. Ms. Autry can go with this as well. There are sort of varying acuity levels, if you will, or and different case mix. Sort of in each cohort. I'm assuming that's probably part of that, and that there's probably an unequal distribution of medically fragile students at each building. There's probably is accounting for that. So that's my guess. Does that sound fair?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And let's take that one step further, Dr. Hall. Now let's look at North. Now I'm also, as the finance officer, I'm making some assumption that we have special education units at North, but I'm also looking at the sped per pupil spend in a pretty high total per pupil level, thinking that we have a higher circumstance of special education identification regardless of units at this location also. And so it could also be based on a population who needs additional services. And so, I guess the important part here is, while I don't have the answers, this provides the next level of budgetary reporting to advise the board and administration in making decisions. So a follow-up question could be, hey, we would like to know, let's really get down into it. Where are special education units in the buildings? Who do they serve? How many students? And how many students to the overall population? And then let's start to look at that. And then the other thing that I think is really interesting, I think Mrs. McKittrick might get a really good sense of this, is the teacher transfer process in an Akron or any other district. It is largely based on seniority. So as a teacher serves in various parts and throughout the career, there becomes more of a relationship of choice on behalf of that staff member and where they ultimately may serve. And if you remember in some early charts that we showed, we saw the average age of some of the buildings and the average spend. So if we really want to get detailed in the spend, we would normalize, and I think Dr. Hall had talked about this concept, we normalize that average salary per building so that we can really get down to the equity statements and how we serve.
Yeah, Ryan, that's actually where I was going, because, I would defer to Ms. McKittrick on this one, but would we be saying that, well, because we've got more experienced teachers in one sped unit, that there's a difference in quality of the product, i.e. the teaching, that the special ed students getting at North as opposed to Firestone. But again, I think to your point, it's probably multifactorial. It's probably again, there's the economy of scale component, there's the case mix component, there's the differential in seniority and teacher salary component. So I agree with you that this is an excellent conversation starter. That we can kind of use to drill it down. But to your point, I would definitely want to normalize. Unless Ms. McKittrick would disagree. I would definitely want to normalize the teacher salary component as well, and try and isolate so that we were looking at apples to apples. So it's a resource question as opposed to the unit cost question, if you will.
Right. It looks like Ms. McKittrick had to drop off, so we'll pull her back into this conversation in the future. So just at a high level, was this or is this helpful? Because I think what we can do is we can programmatically take, whether it's the delivery of instruction in a certain area or it's the purchase of technology. I think this is going to be a really helpful study in one, to communicate to our public, to prove and walk the path of transparency and equity. This is next level stuff, so I'm kind of excited about this.
Hey Ryan, let me ask a quick question. So when you're looking at, for example, the total per pupil, and I apologize, I've had my daughter, 3-week-old, is screaming in the background, so I may have missed parts of this, but
okay.
But that total per pupil, that's including or inclusive of sort of overhead, right? So the cost for utilities in that building, it factors in seniority as well is factored in there. So if you have a building that has more seniority, so you might see a higher total per pupil because you have more experienced teachers concentrated at that particular building. In addition to your point about economy of scale, that's certainly a part of it as well, probably a large part of it. But that's where I was trying to say, if we could sort of normalize across from a unit cost standpoint across students. Say, okay, well, let's pull out sort of like my fixed cost. Where are the differences in my variable cost? And which may be the programmatic component. That's where I was kind of looking to go. And Ms. Autry, I'll defer to you too. I don't know if you have other thoughts as well, but I'd want to normalize the fixed cost of it, to get down to sort of from a classroom resource standpoint, what is the different differences in what's allocated to whom?
So to answer the first part of the question, so the 10,000 is based on general fund spent. So it's just the state local share that we have here in Ohio, not special ed, economically disadvantaged, or any other federal funds. So it's just what is in our current accounting system, which kind of shown here to run the building, divided by the number of pupils, and then we highlighted, we pulled out, we extracted special education. It includes direct classroom instruction, so the teacher class ratio, specials teachers, that includes to some extent substitute teachers, professional development. It includes in the total spend, obviously 10,000, co-curriculars, academic, athletic, guidance support, any safety and security measures, supplies and materials, any social, emotional, security, life supports we wrap up in there. It includes a building leadership component. You can call that principal or dean or assistant principal. Some building operations for, as you mentioned, utilities. And then so we have some district, a little less than 5% of that total budget would be some of the district leadership components, what's central office kind of distributed amongst our 48 buildings or so. So the next step, which you just highlighted, is, so let's normalize this a little bit further, and let's take away our fixed cost and truly look at the variable components. And so I think we can do that in next round, maybe even short order, where I'll take what you're seeing on the screen now is this 1,200 special instruction in this total budget. So this is booked to 405, 9.6 million, 10.3 million, 10.9 million the current year. And we'll pull out all those fixed costs, we'll just purely focus on instruction. And I think we can just pull out the instructional component next, and then overlay average teacher seniority to it. All of that data exists. Now it's just a matter of assembling a few of these dashboards so we can start telling the story.
Well, yeah, because I wonder too, and this is where, I would ask, Dr. James as well as Dr. McWilliams-Woods, is it fair to say that all else being equal, if I have a more experienced teacher as opposed to a newer teacher, that if my product is the education being delivered in the classroom, would the argument go that the more experienced teacher results in a higher quality of the product being delivered in the classroom?
Well, that's the crux of it. We also have to look at teacher effectiveness, because, while a younger teacher may not have the experience as someone who's more veteran, we really need to boil down to, the effectiveness of that teacher. How does their training come into play? There's a lot of other factors that we'd have to look at, but I think this is a perfect example of how we can drill down to some of those issues.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And that's where too, trying to figure out what metrics, and you may already have this figured out, but it would be like, okay, so what metrics do we use to differentiate amongst, and probably part of the teacher evaluation system as well, right? But there probably are measures or metrics to help us to differentiate between more senior educators versus people who are new. I know in healthcare we use what's called effectiveness and efficiency metrics, to sort of look at, it's talking about just how fast one gets to the right diagnosis, but also how many resources were consumed to get there. So if provider A takes 5 tests to get to a conclusion, provider B takes 2 tests, same conclusion, I would say provider B is a more efficient provider of care. So that's where, again, there's a lot of analogies, if you will, between education and healthcare.
Correct.
Okay, I'm going to share this one. So this was an initial kind of first conversation, but I want you to know we've taken it further. We're just in the testing stages. And I'm going to pull over a screen because this will eventually advise the board administration and address and directly talk to our equity and transparency efforts. And so I want to make sure, can everyone see that? It says 5 Lab in the top left-hand screen.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. And this is going to be more of an internal audit. We call it the equity audit. Now you see there's no information populated here. But we did want you to know as a board, through all the conversations, we've got various departments working on these components. So you see 5 Labs. So we're going to take all that aggregate spending data, disaggregate it by building, by OPU, normalize it where we need to in the conversation, and then overlay the following components and many more. So from attendance discipline, report card information, enrollment related to IEP, participation results as it relates to, as you know, some of the initiatives we've had with some local grant funds. And that could be, we're talking about adding a technology component to this, and then tracking all of this. This is going to be really powerful information. And I think, obviously it'll take a couple different twists and turns based on where the board ultimately wants to go. But this is pretty exciting stuff.
Yeah, I agree. This is super exciting. And Ryan, I was enjoying sort of watching you kind of teach this. I was seeing the excitement in your face as you were doing this. You're pretty pumped, like a kid in a candy store. I'm like, yes.
Yes. Right. You hit it head on. And numbers can tell stories. Sometimes the numbers people aren't good storytellers, so we need some help.
Yeah, I appreciate the software. I'm excited as well, and I'm not a numbers person, but it just makes it more, I guess, realistic and palatable. So I'm excited about the possibilities and the different things that we can explore with it. So I appreciate it.
Yeah, it's great. Well, let's finish up with a couple more of those exciting reports. I'll show you here. You should be seeing a screen of the Google Drive that I shared with you.
Yep.
And so let's pull a couple of these out. School, race, ethnicity. Does everybody see that chart?
Yep.
Okay, great.
Yes, can the font be enlarged a little?
Yes.
A little bit. That's better. Yes.
All right. There we go. Just wanted to show you. So I know you looked at a lot of numbers today, a lot of spreadsheets, but we're going to start to put all of these stories in graphic format, right? So we can start to look at demographic changes and racial makeup of our buildings. And they give you a good chance to really peruse this data. And again, I shared these charts with you so you can go in. You can see where certain racial ethnicity groups are growing and shrinking per district and by building and by cluster. So we took it just as you're looking at this chart, one of the components of a fair school funding plan is the identification of additional resources, not only for economically disadvantaged, not only for transportation or food service or special educations, it's our English language learners we have yet to work with. And so the state legislature is using a couple of buildings from districts in their story and telling this. And one of them is our own North Cluster. I've told the stories enough that we may be getting some visits from them when we're emerging from our COVID, because they know there's not enough state resources and local resources in a formula to support a building like Findlay. We might have 20 plus or 25 different languages or even more when we get into the individual dialects of a refugee resettlement area. But surprisingly, one of the districts that as of right now, it's the one that has the biggest challenge is Lakota. There are over 50 different languages in the Lakota district, which Superintendent James, I thought we were right up there with 40, high 30s, low 40s. And then when they were talking about the different dialects, they were approaching 100.
Wow. Hey, Ryan, just out of curiosity, what's on the x-axis? So, for example, North High School, it would seem, if I'm reading this right, that there's not a single white student represented on that bar. So I'm assuming that it scrolls down a little bit.
Yes, there you go.
Oh, okay,
so
gotcha. Okay. I was like,
so current, and then right. So x-axis is the years.
The year. Okay.
So
this is what years?
This is 2015 to 20.
Okay, roger that. Thank you.
Yeah, let's let me zoom out just a little bit. Let's take north, just so everybody sees what we're looking at. So North High School in 2015, about 16% white, a little less than maybe 4.5% or less of 2 or more, Hispanic of 6.6, 32% Black, and 41% Asian. Those are pretty, obviously, broad determining, but these are the ones reported in EMIS. And I think the important part of listing this years is the growth in any one subgroup, and realizing that we should be spending more in the North High School. And this is the high school. We should be spending more at North High School, obviously, for our English learners. And what components of our funding formula are being driven to support that? So again, it's not a matter of right or wrong. It's a matter of being able to communicate that. That's just one chart, right? So I'm just going to pick a couple of these charts. District-wide, the blue component versus students with disability. So we know as a community eligibility partnership district, meaning any district that's over about 70% threshold of economically disadvantaged, and there's a formula that determines that, can apply for something called community eligibility partnership. What we know CEP to be is the care and feeding of our students, both for breakfast and lunch, 100% free. But there's there's a as important component of CEP that's reported to the Department of Education, and those CEP districts, of which there are about 60 in the state of Ohio. Just so you know, as we've been studying this data the last few weeks, a little over 50% of our students in the state of Ohio are economically disadvantaged. 50%. We're referred to within the Department of Education as 100% economically disadvantaged because of our qualification of community eligibility partnership. And then here's we wanted to show you as a percent to that total population, students with disabilities, and kind of where it's been. As you can see, it's been increasing. And a lot of districts will tell you this is their fastest growing component. Let's see. Here's a quick enrollment chart with ELL overlaid, and you can see, although it's kind of a small impact on this chart, it's obviously a pretty significant growing list. And why it's dropped here relative to pretty stable enrollment, and we're going to go, this is a good identification tool for us to say, well, why is it dropping from 17, 18, and 19? Also, if you look at total enrollment here, you look back to 2015, see our trends here of really flattening out. Feel free to download these reports. Here's one on enrollment breakdown, and this is special education percentage across all buildings. You can look at I Promise, Kenmore Garfield, and the legend will be over here to the left. The total school enrollment and school-wide percentage of the enrollment. Couple more here. So this one is average salary with total FTEs. Oh, good. I wanted to show this one. Okay, so this one is average teacher salary and total FTEs. So total FTEs means full-time equivalent teachers. I remember we've reported on state of Ohio reports and those kind of things. About $65,000 is our average salary. We use that as a rough estimate. So when we look at that across the district, that's about right. It looks like we're creeping up there. So 65, maybe 68,000 now. And that's not far from the statewide average. But if you look at this red line, the total number of staff, look at that peak and valley, but then look at the legend below. Let me try to zoom out so you can see that. I want you to see the years. I know you can't see it. So it's 2009 is the first year to 2020 is the last. And you see somewhere around, can't get it to show. Somewhere around 2013, 2012, do you see what happens here to this red line? And if you remember back to the chart that I drew in the orientations about the cyclical nature of school funding, and really the only way that districts in Ohio, because of the way the school funding formula works to address a budget deficit, is to increase revenue, i.e. levy, or to trim expenses. And so you see, as a result of 2012 and the financial needs, how the district addressed this is it reduced staff. And then it's cyclical, and unfortunately it does this all across Ohio. Then you pass an operating levy, and then you slowly build back essential services. Right? And I think all of us believe that we'd rather not do that. We'd rather smooth those peaks and valleys out, which is what we're trying to do now, so that we don't impact the classroom. That's a really good, that's a great chart to tell a story about how this can impact programming.
So Ryan, just a quick question regarding that. I understand, to your point, why we had the drop. And then we were sort of level, looks like, for about 4 years, 3 or 4 years. And then there was a spike from one year to the next there at the end of the graph. So just out of curiosity, sort of what changed from that year to the next? I mean, did we hire a bunch of teachers? Because it looks like our average salary went up at the same time. So I guess I'm just, and thinking about this being a conversation starter, I'm just curious as sort of what happened from that. Was it 18 and 19 or 19 to 20? Yeah.
So there's a lot packed into this, right? So from 2012, 13, 14 is the residual effects of not having money, to freezing salaries, to lessening the amount of bargaining group negotiations, to kind of that built up demand and passing operating levies, and adding back the programming as well as the increase. So some would say, if you look back from 2009 to maybe 2019, that these are fairly level and flat. And you look at kind of all teacher compensation, it looks like what happens here is, I can almost narrate this, is this is the beginning of a teacher negotiated contract. And then there's small increases in cost of living and step increases. And then there's a negotiation where my cursor is, 9, 10, 11, so 12. And then looks like an adjustment for maybe wages were flat at that time or slightly reduced, and people are paying more for health insurance. And then it increments. And then looks like this would be maybe a representation to a district-wide initiative like college and career academies, where it does, when we're talking about a block or a modified, I'm a little out of my space with that, but if we're talking about a block or a modified block and those philosophies that we believe in, it might take some additional staff to do that. And then looks like 19 and 20, So it might be distorted, Dr. Hall, and I can go back and look at this, was this our retroactive pay increases? Right, so the duration between when we settled the contract to where we are now might be some of that, because the incremental difference between 19 and 20 is not that great. But it looks like we made up a year in here.
Great, thank you, Ryan.
Mm-hmm. Okay. That is all I had for tonight, and I'm sure you're ready to get on to your next meeting. Any questions?
No, I don't have any, Ryan. I mean, I thought this was a good start. Definitely looking forward to sort of digging into this in more detail and in future meetings.
Great. Yeah, we'll continue on with this
Yes.
line of thinking.
Thank you.
I'll see all of you here shortly, 5:30.
Yes.
All right, I'm pumped. Can't wait for it.
Okay. See you soon.
All right.
See you later.
Bye-bye.
Bye.